Hello and welcome to day 5 of Women in Antiquity. Today we'll be talking about the Greek Dark Age and the world of Homer that arises toward the end of the Dark Age and as part of the transition into the Greece that we can see and hear, and women as they're presented in Homer specifically, and especially mortal women as they're presented and in their relationships with the men and heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, as part of our background, we have left the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age ends with the period of Calamities. What comes after this is the 400 or so years of the Greek Dark Age, during which time the Greeks have no writing system and are therefore much more difficult for us to hear and understand. And unfortunately, it is during the Dark Age that the key foundations of the Greek society that we know that emerges from it into the archaic and classical periods, all of the key elements of the Greek society are formed during this period and emerge into the light afterwards, more or less fully formed. And so understanding the Greeks has to be done with a certain amount of extrapolation and speculation about the drives that formed the Greek world that we know. So the Bronze Age, as I said before, collapses as a result of the failure of its increasingly growing and interdependent industrial economy. There are four great bronze powers: the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians. And the collapse seems to begin in the Aegean world as a result of a combination of the bursting of the Mycenaean Bronze Age industrial economy, combined with natural disasters and the influx of a massive migration of Dorian Greeks, the second wave of Greeks, into the Aegean world. This produces a domino effect which brings down the economies of the other Bronze Age powers and ushers in a period of difficulty and enforced problems for all the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the recovery that they all undergo is varied and difficult. The Egyptian empire collapses at this time, partly due to an influx of hostile refugees from the Aegean world and Anatolia. The Greeks know them as the Sea Peoples, and they call this period the period of calamities. And as I said before, the Egyptians, never rise to become a power or an empire afterwards. The transition into the Dark Age after the failure of the Bronze Age economy and culture happens along a number of levels, and one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that the Greeks are far from being completely defeated, culturally, socially, and they are also far from stagnant. The idea of decline is usually what is emphasized. This decline is misunderstood and overemphasized. The main component of this is the ending of the form of urban industrial economy that had been prevalent in the Bronze Age, the palace economy and culture that was highly centralized, highly urbanized, that the Mycenaean Greeks had taken over from the Minoans. And with that highly centralized culture is lost both urban technologies and the strict hierarchy of class structure that you tend to find in these very centralized, very urban societies. And so the Greeks of the Dark Age end up resettling in the countryside, in small, isolated agricultural communities where people are more or less on the same level. And so there's a leveling effect, which is quite real and quite profound, and is one of the things that lays the groundwork for later Greek societies. That the people of this community are all in the same boat. They're all peers, and they're all equally putting themselves at risk on behalf of the community. They are all, equally responsible and equally privileged. And the Dark Age agricultural communities that formed during this period after the collapse tend to have, a general sense of, there are people that own property, they're more or less at the same level, and then they choose one person among them who is to be the chieftain to help guide the community toward decisions and to lead them in times of difficulty. And that chieftain becomes the only real kind of authority. He leads the same kind of life. He's a farmer, like all the rest of them, and a property holder. And the only difference in his status or standing really is that he has a slightly larger house with a porch. Where the property holders of the community will meet and discuss the concerns of the community. The whole idea of depopulation and migration. Depopulation has been greatly overemphasized in past studies of the Dark Age. And in fact, what actually happens is that there's a huge influx of people, and the peoples of the Dark Age, some of them leave the Aegean and become refugees into the Egyptian Empire, as we saw. But most of them just resettle in the countryside, and so the Aegean world is this relatively heavily settled territory that where the communities are separated from each other by water or mountain or whatever, so that each community is isolated. But depopulation is not really a good way to describe this. Part of the problem is it's the Dark Age, and it's difficult for us to hear, partly because they have no writing and so they have no documents, but also because it's also difficult for us to find out about them in terms of archaeology. And the reason for this is that these communities are, spread out over the Greek mainland and the Peloponnese and the Balkans and Western Anatolia, as well as all of these islands of the Aegean, some of which are very large. And we don't know where they all are. We don't know where all of these towns and villages are. And so, when archaeologists are digging, they tend to need to know where the human settlements are located. They don't, dig up acres and acres at a time. They dig up, small representative plots that they can, from which they can extract, layers of information and artifacts. And so, not knowing where these small, widely dispersed communities are means that we have relatively few in the way of actual Dark Age towns and villages that have been excavated and analyzed in a systematic archaeological way. So, the other thing to note is that there are a number of things that more or less remain the same. which is everything that has to do with rural agriculture. The agriculture that's practiced out in the countryside during the Bronze Age is more or less the same as the agriculture that's practiced during the Dark Age. Farming a small plot of land is more or less the same. The difference is that now these become these conjoined farming communities of peoples that have resettled, and that these become the basic element of the Aegean world. The other thing about the rural life is, in the ancient world, and especially in Greece and Rome, there are sort of two different kinds of religion, and this is something we haven't really talked about. So that there is sort of the religion of the state, the religion that has to do with the city and the conduct of public affairs. And so this is where the great gods of the pantheon are invoked, Zeus and Athena and so forth and so on. But out in the countryside, in the farmlands, the people are not concerned about Zeus and Athena, although they might be aware of of Aphrodite, of Demeter and Kore, and gods that are associated with the harvest. But broadly speaking, people out in the countryside tend to hold to, I hesitate to say more primitive, but less anthropomorphic, less human-like ideas of the divine. People that are farming the land are more in touch with a more animistic, a more spiritual idea of the potency of nature and how this manifests in sort of abstract ways, having to do with boundaries, having to do with land and doorways and the hearth and so forth. And it's on a much more immediate daily basis, being able to provide during the day and to ensure the forthcoming harvest and so forth. And so these aspects of religion remain more or less the same from across the collapse into the Dark Age. And once again, when we get to the Romans, we'll see that's even more true. There's an even sharper divide between the public religion of the city of Rome and the ordinary, everyday religion, of people in their farmhouses. And this carries over into concepts of gender as associated with gods and goddesses. And then, the really interesting thing about the Dark Age is that this is a time of great development and progress. And this is partly in terms of tangible things that we can point to. The Greeks acquire ironworking during this period. Iron is a game changer in the ancient world. Bronze is a metal that is difficult to work and requires control of two different kinds of metal. It requires both copper and tin, as well as expertise in its production. And so bronze is a more premium metal. Bronze weapons are normally available only to the people at the top of society. Bronze tools are very expensive, and so the society and an economy dependent on bronze needs both a constant and increasing flow of the raw materials that go into it, as well as markets that can afford bronze goods. And this is one of the reasons why the Bronze Age economy develops into a bubble and collapses. Iron, on the other hand, iron ore is much more common. And so as a result, societies that have control of iron working technology are able to provide iron weapons to a wider swath of people, and this leads to larger and more infantry-centric armies. We're talking about not just knives, but also spears. And allows for the availability of iron tools to a much wider segment of the populace, which leads to more efficient farming, which leads to higher productivity, higher agricultural yields, which leads to a better fed society, a higher standard of living, lower death rates, higher birth rates, and as a result, there's a great tidal effect in iron societies compared to bronze societies. But more generally, the transition in the Dark Age is one of transition towards something, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. This is one of the excavations of a Dark Age village, and we see in the inset the plan for the basic chieftain's hut. So this is a house much like those of the others, but it is, as I said, slightly larger, and toward the front is this sort of area where the chieftain meets with the other leading members of society. So the class structure of Dark Age society is different, with a big harbinger for the future. The idea of citizens as property holders and peers, and the development of their culture is different in the Dark Age. One of the things that's really striking about the Dark Age is that the Greeks are deliberately not trying to harken back to Bronze Age culture. Bronze Age culture failed. And so what we see the Greeks of the Dark Age doing is developing a new culture. And this is part of one of the things that I was commenting on yesterday, the idea that the Greeks are pushing toward the ideal culture from this point onward, striving to surpass what they have already achieved, both collectively and individually. And so the forms of decoration that we see in their in the ceramics, ceramics are pottery doesn't rot, and so it's one of the things that we're always going to have, whether intact or in pieces. And the ceramics that we have as one of the most durable examples of how the people of the Dark Age are expressing themselves is something entirely unlike both the Bronze Age Greeks of the Mycenaean era and other societies around them. They're not emulating their past, and they're not emulating the Easterners either. They're not emulating the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians. What they do end up adopting from the East is, once the Phoenician trading system develops over the first few centuries of the Dark Age, the Phoenicians begin exploring contacts with the Greeks in the Aegean, and from the Phoenicians, the Greeks are able to adopt their version of the Phoenician alphabet, which becomes the Greek alphabet. And this happens in the middle of the 8th century. So we start to see, like this, early examples of inscriptions in a Greek text on ceramics. Some of them are very simple, like, I am the pot of Theseus or something. But some of them are, lines of poetry and, things like that. Here's a closer look, and one of the interesting things about this too is that the development of the Greek alphabet happens at more or less the same time. There's a sea change across the Greek world, but it is also adopted in a different form in different areas, and so the alphabet, as it's adopted in Athens, is slightly different from the alphabet that's adopted, in Ionia, in Lesbos, or something like this. In other words, or even in Thebes, which is not all that far from Athens. This is partly because the dialects of Greek are slightly different from place to place. One of the things that the Greeks have in common is the Greek language, but the dialects use or avoid certain sounds or certain combinations of sounds that are part of the ways in which the Greek cities separate themselves off and identify themselves. And so there's actually multiple versions of the Greek alphabet. All of this is only unified when, during the classical period, Athens sort of imposes itself on the Greeks as the cultural center of the Greek world, and especially afterwards during the Hellenic era. With all this isolation, what is it that keeps the Greeks connected? One of the things that keeps them connected is poetry. They don't have the written word. They don't have books that connect them to their past. They just have their collective heritage. But what they do have is the epic poetry of the rhapsode, the bards that sing the stories of the Greek culture, of its past and of its present. And the greatest of this epic poetry is what later becomes commemorated as in the stories of the Trojan War. But there is much more to it than that. And so the stories that are told by the rhapsode, which are long and elaborate, become one of the key foundations of Greek culture and society. And this is it is through these songs, these very long songs, that the rhapsodes master and pass on to their apprentices generation to generation for this 400-year period and more. That the Greeks understand themselves in a very real way, and so it seems it's only natural that they would understand their relationship to the world and their relationship to the divine in terms of these stories and songs as well. And this is one of the reasons why these epic poems become the foundation not only for Greek culture, but for the Greek understanding of their interrelationship with the gods and goddesses of their own pantheon. There is no Bible, there is no church, there are no institutions, there are no priests, there is no priestly class. All of this is very unusual for the ancient world. Most ancient societies have a priestly class. In Egypt, the priestly class becomes politically powerful and rivals the pharaoh for influence over Egyptian society. In Persian society, later on, the magi become so secretive and so in control of the arcane and obscure knowledge of their guild, that learning becomes associated with magic. That learning and religion becomes the province of these people who control things to such a great extent. In terms of religion, in terms of intellectual congress, all to all outsiders, they are as much wizards as anything else. But the Greeks don't have this. The Greeks don't have anything like this. There is public collective ownership of religion in exactly the same way that there is public collective ownership of literature and history. And so as a result, even these key works like Homer become fundamental to Greek education and become the frame of reference to everything that they understand about what it means to be Greek. This includes the idea of arete that I mentioned in the discussion forums. The idea that to be Greek is to strive to surpass and to drive towards the ideal, both for the individual and for the community. This also includes ideas of gender and particularly of family and marriage. So here are some of the key aspects of Homeric society in general. Homer, the works of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are written down sometime during the 8th century. And so, because these are the result of an oral tradition, the way oral tradition normally works is that a story is told and retold from generation to generation so that the essential elements of the story remain more or less intact, but the story is retold in a way that the current audience will understand. And so by the time we get to the 8th century, the 700s, it's been 450, 500 years since the fall of Troy. The stories, the epic poems about the Trojan War, describe the events of 500 years before, but they describe them in terms of the society of the audience. And so, as a result, the Iliad and the Odyssey become useful to us in discerning information both about the Bronze Age, where the stories are set, and the age in which the stories are written down, in describing the social conventions that the people hearing this story would understand, because it's being told in their frame of reference. And so Homeric society is the society around Homer, the society of the end of the Dark Age in the 8th century. And so this Homeric society has a number of components that we can see from a number of factors, including how they manifest in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Regional diversity of custom and tradition. The emergence of Hellenism, the idea that despite all this diversity, there is a common culture that they all share throughout the Aegean world. And this is partly in terms of the contrast to those who are not a part of this world, those who do not speak Greek, and who are defined as the barbaroi. This word literally comes from people who speak languages that sound to the Greeks like the barking of dogs, bar, bar, bar. And so the barbaroi are those who are not as civilized as the Greeks. One of the things that you see in Homer is the understanding that even though there is a rivalry between each Greek city, because they share the Greek culture, there's an expectation of hospitality, and it is always mutual and balanced. So you can go to a city, and if you are a prominent Athenian, you can go to Thebes or Corinth and expect to be housed by someone of that is a counterpart to you in that society, and the reverse is also true. And you're protected and fed and gifted, and that this is a fundamental element. This hospitality, this benevolence toward the stranger, is a necessary outgrowth of the rivalry and competition and sometimes hostility between these communities, all of which have and fiercely pursue their own separate identities. Because fundamentally this idea of arete, this idea of to excel beyond that which you are, is predicated on the idea of doing so through competition. Agon is the Greek for this, and so the obvious manifestation of this is in the Olympics, which are founded in the early 8th century in 770 approximately 767 I think BCE. And this is one of the things, along with the acquisition of the writing system, the new Greek alphabet, that ends the Dark Age and begins the Archaic period. The Olympics has a formal system of athletic competition in which the cities of Greece are very much in competition with each other, and yet share this collective pride in what they are able to accomplish. And so the idea of what we might call glory is partly about the self, but it's about what you are able to achieve, because your achievements are part of the advancement of your community. Your achievements are part of your accomplishment of arete furthers the progress, the evolution of your city and society toward the ideal. And so, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, we see warfare, and we see the story of the Mycenaean Greeks, trade imperial rivalry with Troy across the Aegean, but we also see key elements of what the bonds and connections are between Greeks and what they expect in terms of behavior, often contrasted with what is expected in godly behavior. What we end up seeing when we talk about men and women in Homer is quite striking. So on this diagram we have a number of the key gender relationships that arise in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and one of the things that is striking of this is that Homer, time and time again, comes back to the marital bond as being, one of the key elements of society. And the marital bonds are sort of contrasted with each other in very striking ways. The key contrast would be between Agamemnon and Clytemnestra on the one hand, and Odysseus and Penelope on the other hand. What we're going to be seeing over the course of the next several meetings, because this will come up over and over again in different ways, is that Odysseus and Penelope are presented and remembered as being very much, the ideal marriage in many ways, and not because they're apart from each other for 20 years, but because the marriage is one of balance, one in which Odysseus and Penelope are counterparts to each other. We'll see that again. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to the readings. And so this is contrasted with the strife and division of Agamemnon's family, where Clytemnestra turns away from Agamemnon and instead pursues a relationship with Aegisthus, and this brings about a number of negative things, including the god ordained death and sacrifice of the innocent daughter of Iphigenia, and the equally god ordained murder of Clytemnestra by Orestes, and Orestes ends up subsequently being, hounded by the Furies for the murder of his mother, even though it was ordered by Apollo. We'll see more of that when we look at the excerpt from the play The Furies, which deals with this. And the interesting thing about this is that Clytemnestra is a fascinating figure, because through all of this, it's compelling to see her as a villain, and yet at the same time she is more self-possessed and in many ways wiser and more proactive than Agamemnon is. And Agamemnon certainly is not presented as being any kind of ideal man. The ideal men in the story are Odysseus and, one might say, Hector. And even Odysseus is the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey is partly having to do with the pride that Odysseus is susceptible to, which is one of the things that brings about the punishments that is provided to him by the gods of his separation and wandering before he's finally able to return home. We see in Hector and Andromache a more straightforward and mundane presentation of the balance between the husband and the wife. Hector has his work to do, which is going to war and attempting to save Troy, and Andromache has her work to do, which has to do with household responsibilities. And there's a passage about this which we'll come to later, which sort of emphasizes this and is sort of easy to take as a negative, but it has to do with male and female responsibilities being connected by the marriage bond. So taking a look at the readings individually very quickly. Agamemnon's insult is very short. It primarily concerns the noblewoman Briseis, who is claimed as a prize by the Greeks during one of their raids, and becomes a bone of contention between Agamemnon and Achilles. What's really important here is that Briseis is if you'll pardon the expression, booty. But what's key is to think about, when you read a story like this, why is this story being told? The story is being told not to degrade Briseis. Briseis is being degraded by the Greeks because the Greeks are being filled with pride. Agamemnon and Achilles are expressing different kinds of pride here, and the outcome of this is punishment by the gods for their hubris. This is one of the ways in which the gods are most active in Greek mythology, is to respond to the kinds of actions and behaviors and emotions of mortal men and women that have negative impacts on society. So, greed, selfishness, pride, ambition, these are the things that are punished by the gods. It's very interesting that the gods of the Greeks should be so concerned with, behavior by humans that doesn't affect them, but is negative for the community. The gods are presented as being as reinforcing human morality. And so, even from an early stage, the gods perform this sort of symbolic function. The gods are performing a function that is a supernatural reinforcement of the rules that humans have made for themselves for the benefits of humans. And so already the Greeks have moved beyond the basic motivations of ancient peoples in terms of religion, which is an attempt to minimize the chaos and confusion and of the potency of the wild of nature by ordering it and categorizing it and giving it names, and so in that way, imposing order and empowering themselves as a result. This is the basic element of ancient religion, but the Greeks have taken this further and co-opted the forces of the divine for the improvement of human communities. And that is, in and of itself, unique and remarkable. The story of Nausicaa and the stranger. The stranger, of course, is Odysseus, and this is a cute story. This is illustrating some of the the ways in which people would be assumed to act in unusual situations in Homeric society at the end of the Dark Age. But there are some other interesting aspects of this story as well. And in particular, as you look at this, you want to look at how Nausicaa's father and mother are portrayed as the rulers of Nausicaa's community, and how they balance each other and interact with each other. So take a look at that. The Artifice of Penelope, of course, if you have any awareness of the Odyssey at all, you know that while Odysseus is wandering the Mediterranean for 20 years, his wife Penelope is back home and trying to fend off the leading men of the community who are seeking to wed her and take ownership of the land that belonged to Odysseus. And so part of this is about what the strategies that Penelope uses to hold them off. Interestingly enough, the son Telemachus seems to be relatively powerless to do anything about the way his mother is being treated. It's all on the shoulders of Penelope to preserve things intact for Odysseus to come home to. But once Odysseus does come home, there are some key moments in which Odysseus and Penelope, once they are reunited, express the parity of their marriage bond. They are not equals because they have different kinds of responsibilities to the family and to the community, but they are balanced, and the nature of this balance is infused into the story. It's one of the things that Homer is trying to get across in telling the story, that this is a key element of Greek society. Okay, so the Arthur is one of our longer articles, and it's worth a look. But the main thing that I wanted to point out for you is It's in here that we see the discussion of Hector and Andromache, and the the nature of that relationship is explored. We also see what happens later on in during the Archaic period is that Athens, across the Archaic period and into the Classical period, so the period, the next few centuries after the Dark Age, Athens is undergoing this constant evolution, which in retrospect seems to be moving toward its radical experiment in pure democracy that it finally achieves in the 5th century. And so there are a number of stages of this in which Athenian society is being constantly reformed, and the rules of society are constantly changing, and the extent to which that affects women we'll be looking at over the next couple of days. But the reforms that are accomplished in order to make these changes, some of them, one generation to the next, generally speaking, aren't about, men and women so much as, as the way society is organized and the way that the government is organized, the effects on gender are secondary outcomes. They're fallout from the evolution that Athens undergoes. So we see some of that in this article, the discussion of Solon, one of the great lawgivers of Athens, who undertakes one of these sets of reforms, and we'll be seeing more of that over the next over our other discussions of the Greek world and of Athens in particular. The Ortner article is very interesting, and if you're at all interested in the biological aspect of this, of the idea of gender roles, and this is one of the term paper questions, so you might very well be wanting to sort of think about this and maybe look at this article if this appeals to you, or if you find it intriguing, or conversely, if you find it repulsive to think this way. But one of the things that's unavoidable, not only do we have the idea that women are different biologically, but the way in which this affects how society and culture thinks about women deserves a lot of discussion. Some of what Ortner says in the beginning is way too categorical, where she talks about all societies women are repressed. That's simply not true, especially if you look at the balance between male and female responsibilities, public, private, present, future. The idea of repression and subordination is vastly exaggerated by people who want to see misogyny and who want to impose modern values on ancient cultures. Ancient cultures have to be judged in their own terms. That said, some of the things that are raised in this article are very interesting. Not only is there the point about women's social role as being seen as closer to nature, but the idea of the women's psyche as being seen as closer to nature. So in other words, women are capable of doing biological things that men are not. And this for men makes women the other, makes women capable of much more in tune with nature. They do natural things that men cannot. And so because, as I've said, nature has a ununderstandable potency. Nature itself is powerful and obscure. There's a supernatural aspect to this. So not only are women potentially more in touch with the natural world, which includes the wild, which includes nature and chaos, you know, um, this is one of the reasons why, you know, fertility, obviously fertility is always seen as something associated with female divinities, not only Mother Earth, but fertility goddesses like Ishtar and Demeter. But you know, we take this further, and there's, you know, there's the capacity for mysticism. There's a capacity for you know, women being, you know, more attuned to the occult, and we'll see this especially if a woman is a foreigner, and so even more the other. There's a possibility of you know, of association of witchcraft with women, which we see in, most famously, Medea. We'll be talking about Medea in a couple of days, but this carries forward into Western civilization in many ways. And so this is one of the things that creates the disconnect between men and women. Of course, is not just the simple biological differences, but all the things that emerge from this as a result of, you know, of men seeing women as the other. The Dowden article is an important reminder that mythology can't be mapped onto Greek society. There are serious difficulties in looking at mythology, or even, you know, Greek literature about mortals, which includes Iliad and Odyssey, as well as you know, tragedy, comedy, and other you know, forms of poetry that we'll be looking at later. Because these are stories that are told to create scenarios that that express you know, cultural bylaws, but often through their violation or through the creation of individuals or circumstances that are unreal, in order to highlight and put into relief that which is expected and normal. And so, you know, this is an interesting article for looking at a couple of specific examples of this, particularly with respect to Clytemnestra. You know, if you want my advice, you know, whether during this course or later, you want to look at everything that you can about Clytemnestra, because she is a polarizing figure, and in terms of, you know, gender in Homer, and in, you know, in Greek tragedy of later generations, you know, there are a number of you know, Clytemnestra provides a number of very striking, you know, jumping off points for making arguments about the Greek relationship with gender, with maternity, and so forth. And finally, the divided world of Iliad 6 is discusses a number of women and relationships that are presented in Homer, including there's more here about Hector and Andromache, and the and attempts to draw some conclusions about how Homer is depicting marital relationships and relationships between men and women in general. So take a look at these readings, and I'm very much interested in hearing your responses in the forums on you know, on Odysseus and Penelope, on Hector and Andromache, on, you know, Priam and Hecuba, and you know, Briseis and Cassandra, and, you know, for that matter, Helen. You know, one of the things that always ends up happening about you know, in terms of the Trojan War, is that Helen gets the blame for starting all of this, but she tends to get lost in the shuffle as we talk about all of these other moments of heroism and moments of unheroism as well. So take a look at all these things, and see you in the discussion forums.